In fact, businesses around the world, ever since the global financial crisis, have had major problems trying to pass on cost increases. Hello again, everybody. Apologies about the hair. I'm trying not to look too much in the mirror at the moment. I'm going to give it a couple of weeks and then I can feel a bit like myself again. I thought I'd discuss today some of the comments we're seeing around about inflation rising in New Zealand and around the world, because there's a little bit of a risk. Some people are starting to think maybe we're going to go back to the 1970s or the 1980s. Those of you who might have been around at that time will recall that inflation averaged just over 11% in both the 1970s and the 1980s. And the floating mortgage rates, which at the moment are around about 4.5% or so, they were around about 9.5% on average in the 1970s and about 16.5% on average in the 1980s. We are not going back to that sort of an environment for a whole variety of reasons. And I'm going to run through about 7 of them at the moment, but there's probably a few more sitting out there, meaning you don't need to worry about that sort of environment returning, but we are eventually going to get some increase in interest rates. Maybe for the floating rates it starts to the second half of 2022 in New Zealand. Now, one of the big reasons for inflation in the 1970s was that oil prices quadrupled over 1973-74 and then went up again later on in the decade. It got the whole inflation ball sort of rolling. And what we had back then was a high degree of unionisation in economies around the world. So unions obviously got some decent wage increases for their members, but importantly, we also had a lot of protected business sectors, and so the businesses could easily put up their prices. Governments were protecting them with tariffs from goods being imported from overseas, etc. And often, quite frankly, there was a cozy relationship between the unions and the businesses on the other side. We don't have that sort of institutional factor in place any longer. In fact, businesses around the world, ever since the global financial crisis, have had major problems trying to pass on cost increases. Now, obviously, that's happening a lot in the construction sector at the moment as a result of supply chain difficulties. But that, you see, just highlights that a lot of the inflationary pressures we're seeing out there are in fact temporary. Eventually, those supply chains will get sorted out. The computer chips will be flowing again into the motor vehicles overseas, and so prices will start changing there. So that, importantly, is a big difference from back then. Also, for your householders these days, we've got a lot more debt than we ever used to have here and overseas. So our sensitivity when interest rates start rising is far greater than in the past, where the interest rates would go up, we'd keep spending. These days, you'll get a reaction, especially because, again, these days, we're all used to very low interest rates. And again, when the rates start rising, a whole generation of borrowers will learn, actually, floating interest rates can float up as well as floating down. The central banks will get good bang for their buck when they start tightening. And that takes me to the final reason why I don't think you should aggressively worry about really high inflation and massively high interest rates out there. Back in the day, the 70s into the 80s, central banks were not independent, largely, of their governments. They didn't get on top of the rising inflation at any sort of reasonable speed. The whole thing just sort of kept going along, and then eventually they attacked things very strongly late in the 1970s and through the 1980s. This time around, central banks will let things go as long as they can in order to get maximum growth in their economies, and then they'll nip the whole thing in the bud, probably starting in New Zealand late 22 and over 2023-24, interest rates rising around the rest of the world. So, allow for interest rates going up, but don't be listening to too many of those stories from back in the 1970s. All the best.